Hi, this is Melanie from Artifact and Landmark. This video is the second in a series about the Bryce glass family from Pittsburgh. The first video covered their voyage from Scotland to Pittsburgh and their early beginnings in the city. This video follows the family from 1845 until about 1891. If you watched our last video, you know we left the Bryces in 1845 on the edge of their move across the Monongahela to Pittsburgh's south side. What prompted the move was James Bryce's return to glassblowing after a 5-year absence due to the economic downturn that started in 1837. On April 1st, James recorded in his diary that he was finally back to what I was trained up for and gloried in, a working mechanic. Within days, the family would watch their city burn. The fire occurred on April 10, 1845. It tore through Pittsburgh and destroyed much of it, including the Bakewell Glassworks where James and his brothers Robert and John had learned their glass trade. The fire took the first Bryce's homes with it, but left their current home in the Bluff area untouched. In the diary, he also wrote that the previous 4 or 5 years were wasted as a shopkeeper and a chandelier, including a stretch with Walker & Co. It's important to remember that name Walker. We're certain it's the same Walker family who later becomes partners in Bryce Walker & Company, so those lean years weren't wasted at all. They built the connections that mattered. By 1845, James, now is 33 years old, was married to Elizabeth Haw, a neighbor of his aunt in Ohio. He and Mother Agnes were the only 2 Bryces remaining from the 5 who made that trip from Scotland in 1818. By this time, James had 5 children and sadly had buried one, their son Hay, in 1842, and they would also part with their daughter Jane in September of that year, 1845. James's 2 brothers, Robert, is about 24 years old and was newly married to Elizabeth French, and youngest brother John is about 21. James' new employer on the south side is Mulvaney's, a flint glass manufacturer at the foot of what's now 17th Street on the south side. They manufactured cut, molded, and plain glass. And with this new job, of course, the family make the trip across the Monongahela, settling on the south side on Washington Street, now known as Sarah Street. So the 1850s are pivotal for the Bryces. We can see that they're clearly finding stability and venturing into really promising partnerships. By 1850, James is celebrating 15 years of marriage and was 2 years shy of his 40th birthday. By the end of the decade, his family included 11 children, with 8 surviving, having unfortunately lost another daughter, Mary, in 1855. His eldest son, John, a glass pattern maker, will also get married during this decade to Elizabeth Gribben in 1859. James's fortunes grow during this period, although he has a setback in 1853 when his property in the Bluff neighborhood is seized and sold for unpaid loans. Even with the setback, by the end of the decade, James will have a net worth of about $500,000 in today's money. His brothers are also faring well. His brother Robert and his wife Elizabeth are settling into their home with their 2 daughters and son. Elizabeth's 2 aunts are also living with the family, and they are Elizabeth and Martha McCullough. Youngest brother John has married Mary Haw in 1845, and she is a sister to James's wife, Elizabeth. By the end of the 1850s, John's family has 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter. John's family home also includes the Bryce Brothers matriarch Agnes, who is at a very good age of 76 by the end of the decade. What helped bring about this stability in the 1850s are the family's glasswork partnerships during this decade. First partnership we spot in October 1850 in a paper's import by Rivers notice. The partnership is McKee Co, which includes our 3 Bryce brothers, along with Frederick and James McKee, amongst others. The location of the initial factory on the south side is at 21st and Wharton, and this factory would remain as part of the business until it was sold off decades later to U.S. Glass in 1891. In December 1850, we also see that James may be continuing to do some work for the Walkers, since we also see Bryce McKee Co. importing soaps and candles. Again, this may help them down the road. This partnership with the McKees wouldn't last. We see both brothers, Frederick and James McKee, leave the partnership by 1854. They go on to form their own glassworks. A new partnership, Bryce Richards & Co., is formed and would include the future founders of another glassworks, Richards and Hartley. Now, if the 1850s set the Bryce fortunes in motion, then the 1860s is where they really gained momentum. Although they're clearly doing better financially, this actually doesn't shield them from tragedy. We also see the brothers settling into their homes, with James at 21st and Sydney, Robert at 2017 Sarah Streets, and youngest brother John at 32 20th Street. Although they don't lose any children to the Civil War, they do lose them through disease and natural causes. James's son John passes away in 1864, leaving behind one son, Marion. James's son Andrew and Robert both enlist and survive the Civil War, mustering out as corporals in 1865. They rejoin their brothers and cousins in the glass business. James's brother Robert is touched twice by grief, with the loss of his newborn daughter Sarah and his son William. They pass within months of each other. Youngest brother John is also touched by grief with the passing of his eldest son James in 1865. The brothers also lost their mother in 1866, leaving the three brothers on their own. She was 83 years old. Now, after the Civil War, one of the most important partnerships is formed, and this one is with the Walkers. The new partnership comes about because three of their existing partners leave to form Richards and Hartley, which is a very well-known glassworks from the Victorian period. Now, you can still find glass from this period produced by the Bryce brothers. One pattern that's commonly found is Excelsior, and another one is Tulip. You can also see these at various museums, including the Chrysler, Met, Carnegie, and Heinz. So we start the 1870s with all three brothers still in partnership. But by decade's end, we see the youngest brother John walk away, and it's likely because there wasn't enough room in the partnership for his three sons. We also see brother Robert become less active in the firm and take on some civic duties. He becomes president of the Board of Education for the Humboldt School on the south side, which is located just a block away from his house. The family's fortunes continue to improve. At the beginning of the decade, James is now 58. Has accumulated about $1 million in assets in today's money, while Robert, now 49, has about $700,000, and youngest brother John is 47 and has about $400,000. Now, during this period, there are also several outbreaks of diseases. Tuberculosis is actually a leading cause of death in Pittsburgh during this time. So not surprisingly, tuberculosis touches the Bryce family. Both James and John lose children to the disease. Somehow Robert is spared of any loss. James loses his only remaining daughter, Aggie, and son Robbie to tuberculosis. His brother John loses his daughter, Mary Jane. James, unfortunately, also loses his daughter-in-law, Lizzie, in 1875 to heart disease, and takes on the responsibility of raising grandson Marion, who also suffers with poor health during this period. Now, we know that this wave of death was hard on James, and he recounts in his diary being particularly hard hit by losing his only remaining daughter, Aggie. This grief is on public display at the Bryce's grave located in the Allegheny Cemetery. You'll find an inscription at the base of the obelisk that mirrors his diary entry from 1873, which you can see here. 1873 also is the beginning of the Long Depression, or what's called the Great Panic of 1873, which will last until about 1878 or 1879. This creates an economic downturn for everyone, including the Bryces. 1873 is also the only year we know of when James won a seat on a ward city council. He would be 60 at the time. During this period, too, in 1876, James decides to take a trip back to Scotland, accompanied by his wife Elizabeth, son Frank, and grandson Marion. They sailed the following year on Cunard steamer Sia, visiting Ireland, Scotland, England, and France. Included in that trip is a stop at the farm and home where James was born, which you can see on this map. The trip is reported to have cost roughly $2,000 or $60,000 in today's money, and we estimate it lasted about 2 months. The family had quite a bit to celebrate during this decade. James celebrates 4 of his sons' marriages. The first son to marry is Andrew, who marries Mary J. McClung in 1870. They first built a home next door to Father James, but will soon move next to his brother Donald in Mount Oliver. They would go on to have 3 daughters and 1 son. Andrew would lose 2 daughters and his wife by 1890. This family were active in the temperance movement, joining the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Prohibition Party, as well as establishing the Newsboys Sunday School. Andrew also served as vice president of the Western Flint and Lime Glass Protective Association, and he'll become secretary of U.S. Glass before deciding to leave to found the second iteration of Bryce Brothers with brother Donald. Son Robbie married Maddie Heron in 1871, but he passes in 1874. They unfortunately have no children. With his passing, his widow Maddie sold Robbie's shares back to Father James, who redistributed them amongst the surviving sons. We can see the redistribution in this news clipping. Son Donald married Emily Saul in 1878, and they made their home in Mount Oliver. They welcomed 2 daughters and a son. Donald will also work for U.S. Glass before founding the second Bryce Brothers with brother Andrew. Son David married Mary Norris, and they made their home on Seneca Street in the Bluff area. They go on to have 2 sons, who unfortunately both passed from malnutrition before reaching 4 months old. One of David's focuses is to establish the first hospital for the South Side, and unfortunately he passes in 1885 of typhoid. Now James's 2 brothers, Robert and John, also see a child tied in a knot. Robert's daughter, Catherine Bryce, marries Percy F. Smith in 1879. They first settle in Allegheny City and then move across the river to Ingram. He was a publisher and would write the book Notable Men of Pittsburgh, among many others. I'm specifically pointing out this book since we use many images in our videos from this book. John's son, Charles K. Bryce, marries Emma Doyle in about 1872. She's the daughter of Joseph Doyle, who established Doyle & Co. on the South Side, and who is an initial partner of Bryce Higbee Co. The couple first lived next to Father Joseph Doyle on Doyle Avenue in West Homestead. They have 1 son and a daughter. Charles worked for Bryce Walker & Co. and filed a patent in 1879. We also get a glimpse into Charles' personality when in 1877, his next-door neighbors, father-in-law Joseph Doyle and brother-in-law William H. Steinley, are both burglarized. The thieves, successful in those break-ins, then tried their luck again with Charles Holmes, who chases them away. Of course, this decade also marks the end of an era with the departure of youngest brother John Bryce to form Bryce Higbee Co. With this departure, his sons also leave to join the New Works, located in Homestead, about 6 miles from John's home on 20th Street. John filed essentially all the patents for the partnership. You can see some of the designs, with one filed in 1876, which is probably one of the most popular early patterns. It's known as Imperial in the patent, and more generally known as Maltese and Jacob's Ladder by collectors. So after John leaves, we're at the beginning of the 1880s. We find our 3 brothers, James, now 67, Robert, now 58, and John, now 55, still living next to each other on the South Side. Of course, James and Robert are still with Bryce Walker & Co., while John is building the new glassworks of Bryce Higbee & Co. During this decade, the family suffers more losses. James' son David, as we mentioned earlier, passes in 1885. Then we also see the first brother, John, passing in 1888. James not only loses his brother, but he also sadly loses his wife in that same year of 1888. They also suffer the loss of their partner, William Walker, who passes in 1883. He was unfortunately on a mental decline a few years before this, and this is why his wife sells off their interest in the partnership in 1882. And that's when we see Bryce Walker & Co. get dissolved, and we see the new firm of Bryce Brothers form in 1882, with many of James' sons joining the firm, as well as Robert's son, Edwin. This decade also brings more marriages. James sees the marriage of his sons Allie and Frank, as well as his grandson Marion. Now, son Allie marries Maggie Redmond in 1882. They have a son and daughter. They first live at 2116 Sydney Street. Maggie Bryce would also be active in the temperance movement, becoming secretary of the Allegheny chapter of the WCTU. Allie will eventually lead the glasswork factories for U.S. Glass and get involved in other local businesses before becoming president of the second iteration of Bryce Brothers. Son Frank married Margaret Maybon in 1883, and they had no children. They first lived on the north side and then moved to Sylvan and Hazelwood, living with Marion. The 2 families later relocate to 3422 Forbes Avenue in 1888. Frank would head the London office for U.S. Glass before leaving for Bryce Brothers to become treasurer. He would also become president of Bryce Brothers before his passing. Now, grandson Marion first marries Marion Snelling Lewis in 1884. They have a daughter and 2 sons before she passes away in 1889. He will remarry twice, first to Julia S. Waters, who passes in 1904. She has 2 sons with Marion. He then marries Julia Frances Mayhard, known more as Frances, and they have 1 daughter. Marion stays with U.S. Glass, eventually becoming the president, as well as a partner in the firm of that second iteration of Bryce Brothers. James's brothers, Robert and John, also see their children marry. Robert's daughter Mary weds John Aldred in 1880. John is the brother of Windsor Glass founder William H. Aldred. They would settle at 2119 Sydney Street, just a few blocks away from Robert. This is also the same John Aldred that will eventually sell the Windsor Glassworks property to Carnegie. They have no children, but will be close to brother Edwin's family. Robert's only surviving son, Edwin, weds in 1891, just as Bryce Brothers is being sold off to U.S. Glass. He married Jane G. Garrett, and they have 2 sons. Edwin will work for U.S. Glass, managing Factory B. He will also found McDonald Glass, which has a short life of only 3 years. Now, John's son, Robert, marries Mary A. Wolfe in 1882, a daughter of Captain John Wolfe. They will make their home at 315 2nd Avenue in Homestead. Robert would be a council member for Homestead, and his wife, like many of the Bryce wives, will be involved in many social and charitable organizations. John's daughter Ida marries by Connor Shaw in 1888, and their mother, Mary Haw, moved in with them at their home at 3608 Bates Street in Pittsburgh. John's youngest son, John, marries Harriet G. McLaughlin in 1888. Unfortunately, she passes in 1892. He remarries Stella Blanche Kevin in 1895, but unfortunately they have no children prior to his passing in 1896. John would remain at the family home at 32nd 20th Street on the south side for the remainder of his short life. Now, we mentioned that David Bryce was focused on building a hospital on the south side, and if you watched a video about John Adams, he was actually leading the effort and grew very frustrated that he couldn't raise the money during his lifetime. Now, David Bryce passes in 1885 and John Adams passes in 1886, but the Bryce women had carried on their efforts. In 1891, we see Emily, wife to Donald. She hosts a lawn fete at her home in Mount Oliver. She and Mary Bryce were both part of the Ladies' Aid Society of the Southside Hospital, so they would see the hospital open in 1893. So that's where we'll leave things with this video on the Bryce Glass family. In the next and final installment of this series, we'll cover how the family navigates their way through the deaths of the 2 remaining brothers, James and Robert Bryce, the sale of Bryce Brothers to U.S. Glass, the controversial end of Bryce Higbee Co., the founding of McDonald Glass, and the later years of this family.